The world beyond the windshield had turned into a single, furious color, white, thick as paint, whipped sideways by wind that sounded like it wanted to tear the mountains apart. Logan Pierce kept both hands on the steering wheel, knuckles pale beneath worn leather gloves, as the headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the storm. 36 years old, broad-shouldered and tight-jawed, he wore his exhaustion the way some men wore cologne, invisible until you got close, then unmistakable. A shadow of stubble darkened his cheeks. A thin scar notched his right eyebrow, the kind that looked like a story he'd stopped telling. In the passenger seat, Atlas shifted his weight with a soft woof, the movement of a dog who understood danger before it arrived. Atlas was a golden retriever, 3 years old, tall and athletic, with a dense, honey-gold coat that seemed to hold warmth even in winter. His ears perked forward and then back again, tasting the wind through the cracked window, his nose working in quick, purposeful pulls. He'd been trained for search and rescue, not the flashy kind, not the movie kind. Real training, patient and methodical, where the reward was a tug toy and the real prize was the moment a missing person opened their eyes. Even now, with the truck heater blasting and the radio hissing static, Atlas was listening to the storm like it was speaking directly to him. Logan had told himself this drive would be simple. In and out. Get to the cabin. Lock the door. Let the mountain silence do what no therapist ever quite managed. He wasn't on a mission anymore. He wasn't the man who kicked in doors overseas and came home with the same face but different eyes. He was just a guy with a beat-up pickup and a dog who still believed Logan could fix things. The tires hit a slick patch. The truck skated half a foot, and Logan's chest tightened like it used to when the ground beneath him wasn't predictable. He corrected, steady and smooth, like muscle memory had its own religion. Atlas leaned into the movement and steadied himself, nails clicking once on the rubber mat, then went still, too still. His head lifted, his nostrils flared. A low, almost inaudible rumble gathered in his throat, not aggressive, not barking, just a warning hum that vibrated through the cab. "Hey, what is it, buddy?" Logan murmured, voice rough from disuse. Atlas didn't look at him. He looked into the whiteout ahead, eyes bright amber against the storm's glare, and gave one short, sharp huff, his alert. Logan's foot eased off the gas. The headlights swept over the right shoulder of the road, and at first, Logan saw nothing but drifting snow. Then something moved, dark against the white, hunched like a broken fence post. It swayed. It took a step. Wand, the shape resolved into a woman, bent forward into the wind and behind her. Too small, too close to the ground, more shapes, staggering and stumbling like the storm was trying to push them back into the mountain. Logan's breath caught hard enough to sting. "No," he whispered, and then, louder, as if saying it could undo what he was seeing. "No." Atlas gave a single bark, not loud, not panicked, an insistence. Logan hit the brakes, the truck fishtailed, the tail end sliding half a lane before the tires found purchase. Snow sprayed up in a ghostly arc. Logan threw the gear into park, grabbed the heavy coat from the back seat, and shoved the door open. The wind slapped him so hard it felt personal. Cold surged up his sleeves, under his collar, down his spine. The world smelled like ice and exhaust and something else, fear, sharp and metallic. Atlas leapt down after him, landing with a soft thud, immediately moving to Logan's left side the way he'd been trained, body angled protective but non-threatening. Logan trudged forward, boots sinking, and the woman froze as if the storm had turned her into stone. She had an infant bundled tight to her chest, the baby's face tucked against her coat. Her hair, dark brown, nearly black, was plastered to her cheeks in damp strands, rimed with tiny crystals. She wore a thin jacket that might have been warm in October and was a cruel joke in December. Behind her were 3 children, an older girl, maybe 12, shoulders squared in a way that didn't match her trembling, a boy around 8 with a knit hat pulled down too far over his eyes, and a little girl, maybe 5, whose mittens were mismatched and whose lips had the faint, terrifying blue tint of cold. The woman's eyes locked onto Logan's and didn't blink. They were a clear, storm-dark gray, the kind that held too much. "Stay back," she said, and her voice wasn't loud enough to carry far, but it didn't need to be. It had the sharpness of someone who'd learned that pleading was wasted energy. Logan stopped 3 steps away and raised his hands slowly, palms out. Okay, he said, low and steady. Okay, I'm stopping. Atlas sat without being told, tail still, posture calm, his gaze sliding over the children like he was counting them, cataloging their shivers. The older girl shifted, trying to put herself between Logan and her mother. Atlas's ears flicked and he lowered his head slightly, an appeasement signal, then looked away on purpose, like he knew that eye contact could feel like pressure. Owa Logan swallowed, forcing his own adrenaline to settle. My name's Logan, he said. I'm not here to hurt you. This is Atlas. He nodded toward the golden retriever. Atlas's mouth opened slightly, breath puffing warm fog, and he did something that never failed to disarm people. He sneezed, a soft, ridiculous little snort that made him look less like a working dog and more like someone's beloved idiot. The boy's eyes widened despite himself. The little girl made a tiny sound that could have been a laugh if she had more strength. Logan took that sliver of human reaction and held it carefully. You're on Wolf Creek Pass, he continued. In this weather, you can't be out here. The woman's grip tightened on the baby. We're fine, she lied, and Logan saw the tremor in her arms, the way her knees kept threatening to buckle. The baby whimpered once, a thin sound swallowed by the wind. Logan took a breath that burned his lungs. No, he said gently. You're not. He pointed back toward his truck, where warm air poured faintly from the vents. I've got heat, blankets, a cabin 15 minutes down the road, closer if the storm doesn't get worse. Please, get in the truck. The older girl lifted her chin. Why? She demanded, voice cracking with cold and courage. Logan's gaze softened. Because I've been stuck out in weather like this, he said. And someone help me. That's the only reason. He glanced at the woman again. And because no one survives alone. The phrase came out before he could stop it. Old words from old training, but it landed different here, less like doctrine and more like a promise he didn't deserve to make. The woman's eyes flickered, toward the baby, toward the children, toward Atlas sitting like a golden statue against the storm. Atlas turned his head slightly and looked at her, not hard, not demanding. Just present. He shifted his body a few inches so the wind hit him more than it hit the kids. A subtle movement, but Logan noticed. Atlas always took the worst of the weather first. The woman's jaw worked as if she was chewing on the idea of trust. Then she looked at her oldest child, and in that look, Logan saw the math of desperation. How many minutes before the baby's fingers went stiff? How long before the smallest one stopped feeling her toes? How pride mattered less than breathing. Aaron, she said finally, voice quieter now. My name is Aaron. Logan nodded once, like it was an honor. Aaron, he repeated. I'm going to pick up the kids and put them in the back seat, okay? Atlas will stay right here. He won't touch them unless they touch him. He's trained. Aaron didn't answer, but she didn't step back either. That was permission enough. Logan moved carefully, every motion slow and announced. He scooped the little girl first. She weighed almost nothing, a bundle of bones and winter air. Atlas stood and backed up on his own to make space, tail low and friendly. Logan set the child on the back seat and pulled a blanket from the floorboard. The girl stared at Atlas, wide-eyed, and Atlas responded by placing his head on the edge of the seat, offering warmth without climbing in. The boy went next, stubborn until his knees wobbled, then letting Logan lift him with a muffled sob of embarrassment. The older girl climbed in by herself, as protecting her dignity with all the strength she had left. Aaron followed, still clutching the baby, her shoulders tight as drawn wire. Logan held the door so the wind wouldn't slam it into her. For a heartbeat, she hesitated, looking down the empty, roaring road behind them, as if expecting headlights to appear out of the white. Logan saw the fear sharpen in her eyes, not the fear of the storm, the fear of being found. Atlas noticed too. He stepped closer to Aaron's leg and leaned his warm weight into her shin, a gentle pressure that said, without words, "You are not alone right now." Aaron flinched at first, then her posture loosened a fraction, the smallest surrender. She climbed into the truck. Logan shut the doors, sealing them all inside a sudden bubble of heat and muffled sound. The children immediately curled toward the vents, hands out like offerings. The baby's face turned into the warmth and made a sleepy, confused noise. Aaron sat rigid, chest heaving, eyes fixed forward. Oh, Logan slid behind the wheel and started the engine. The dashboard lights cast his face in pale green. He glanced in the rearview mirror and caught the older girl watching him like a guard dog, fierce, suspicious, exhausted. Logan didn't blame her. "Seatbelts," he said softly. Atlas hopped into the front passenger seat and turned around, placing his paws on the console so he could face the kids, his head tilted as if he were counting again. The little girl reached out, hesitated, and then touched Atlas's fur with two trembling fingers. Atlas stayed perfectly still, only his tail thumping once against the seat, slow and steady. The sound was small, but it changed the air. Logan eased the truck back onto the road, following the faint grooves of previous tires like they were a lifeline. Outside, the storm tried to erase everything. Inside, a golden retriever breathed warm and even, and 4 children learned, maybe for the first time in a long time, that safety could be a sound. Logan's cabin lights finally appeared through the whiteout like a low, patient star. He turned into the narrow drive, tires crunching over packed snow, and parked close to the porch. "We're here," he said. Erin's shoulders lifted and fell, like she'd been holding her breath for miles. Atlas whined softly, eager to work, and as Logan opened the door, Atlas jumped down first, trotting to the porch steps and looking back as if to say, "This way, follow me." Logan didn't miss the symbolism. He just hoped he could live up to it. The cabin didn't look like much from the outside, just a weathered rectangle of timber crouched beneath the pines, porch rail half buried in drifted snow, a single amber light over the door struggling against the whiteout. But the moment Logan pushed it open, warmth rolled out like a living thing. It smelled of pine resin, old smoke, and the faint metallic tang of tools. The heater in the truck had helped, but this was the first real barrier between Erin's family and the storm that wanted to claim them. Atlas trotted in first, nails clicking on the wooden floorboards, then turned and sat to the side of the doorway, as if he'd been assigned to be the doorman of the universe. His golden coat was damp with snowmelt, but he didn't shake it off right away. He waited, eyes tracking each small body that passed him, counting again. Logan brought the kids in one by one, and the cabin immediately filled with soft, stuttering sounds. The scrape of boots, the cough of cold lungs, the whimper of a baby who couldn't decide whether warmth was a blessing or a surprise. Erin entered last. She didn't step fully inside at first. She stood on the threshold with the baby tight to her chest, shoulders still braced as if she expected hands to grab her from behind. Her gaze swept the corners of the room in quick, practiced angles. Windows, exits, shadows. Logan recognized the scan. He'd done it in villages where doorways hid wires and in hotel rooms where the second-floor window was the only way out. He hated recognizing it on a woman holding a child. "You can lock it," Logan said quietly, nodding toward the deadbolt. Erin's eyes flicked to him, then to the door. She took one step in, kept one foot near the threshold, and slid the bolt into place with a sharp click that seemed too loud in the cabin's hush. Atlas exhaled through his nose, a warm puff, and finally shook. Snow crystals sprayed in a glittering halo, and the smallest girl, still bundled in Logan's blanket, blinked hard and then giggled once, thin and surprised. Logan moved to the wood stove. It sat in the corner like an old black bear, scuffed and dependable. He fed it 2 split logs and adjusted the damper the way his hands remembered from a childhood he rarely visited anymore. Flames licked up, hungry, and the cabin's warmth deepened, becoming something you could feel in your bones instead of just on your skin. "Bathrooms there," he said, pointing down a short hallway. "There's towels. Hot water might take a minute. Kitchens, well, you'll see." Erin didn't answer. She drifted toward the couch, knees stiff, and lowered herself, with the baby still pressed to her chest. The infant's tiny face peeked out from the blanket, red cheeks, eyelids heavy, lips trembling in a silent complaint. Erin's fingers stroked the baby's back in a rhythm that looked less like comfort and more like counting. 1, 2, 3, staying in control. The older girl stood near the wall, arms folded tight, watching Logan as if he might transform at any second into the kind of man Erin ran from. The boy hovered near the stove, palms out to the heat. The smallest girl sank to the floor with a sigh, then reached out toward Atlas again, drawn to him like warmth had a heartbeat. Atlas approached slowly, head lowered, tail sweeping in gentle arcs. He sat a careful distance away and offered his shoulder. The girl leaned into his fur as if she'd been doing it her whole life. Erin noticed. Her eyes softened for half a second, then hardened again, as if softness was dangerous. Logan opened a cabinet in the kitchen and stared at the contents like it was a puzzle he'd failed before. A half-empty box of oatmeal packets, 2 cans of soup, a jar of peanut butter, a bag of rice. He could survive on that. 5 extra mouths was another story. Still, he had something. He filled a pot with water and set it on the stove's small burner, then found the kettle and lit the propane under it. The motions were automatic, the kind of competence that kept him steady when his mind tried to wander. "I've got oatmeal," he said. "And soup, not fancy." Erin's voice came out thin. "We don't need anything." Logan didn't argue. He'd learned that people in shock didn't hear logic. They heard tone. "It'll be hot," he offered instead. "Helps." The boy nodded immediately, too hungry to pretend. The older girl's jaw clenched, but she didn't stop him. Logan set out mismatched bowls. He found cocoa packets in a tin left over from a life he'd once imagined here, friends, family, laughter, and felt something twist low in his ribs. He didn't touch the thought. He poured hot water, stirred oatmeal, and the cabin filled with the simple, human smell of food. Atlas lay on the rug near the stove, but his eyes never fully closed. Every few seconds his ears twitched toward the windows, toward the wind, toward Erin's tight breathing. Logan crouched by the boy. "What's your name?" he asked gently. The boy's eyes darted to Erin, as if names were something that needed permission. Erin didn't look up. She only nodded once, barely visible. "Caleb?" the boy whispered. "Caleb?" Logan repeated. "Okay, Caleb, there's cocoa if you want it." Caleb's shoulders sagged with relief. The smallest girl, cheeks flushed, hair tangled, peered around Atlas's neck. "I'm Sophie," she said, the words tumbling out like she'd been holding them in her mouth for miles. Logan smiled softly. "Hi, Sophie." The older girl didn't volunteer. Logan didn't push. He held out a bowl anyway. "For you, too." She took it after a long beat, fingers shaking. She didn't say thank you. She didn't have to. Erin finally spoke when the baby started fussing louder, rooting against her coat. "He's hungry." Her voice cracked on the last word, not with emotion, but with the exhaustion of trying to be everything at once. Logan's gaze dropped to the baby. "Formula?" he asked. Erin's eyes flashed. "No." Then, softer, defeated. I didn't bring enough." The confession hung in the warm air like a bruise exposed. Logan nodded once, accepting the truth without letting it become shame. "Okay," he said, "we'll figure it out." He didn't say how, because he didn't know yet, but he said it anyway. In the hallway closet, he found an old cooler and, miraculously, a sealed can of infant formula left over from his sister's visit years ago. A visit that had ended before it started, when the ranch fire had taken his family's plans and turned them into ash. Logan stared at the can like it had appeared by mercy. He carried it back slowly, as if sudden luck might spook the room. Erin's eyes widened, then narrowed, suspicious of Grace. "Where did you—" "Old stuff," Logan said simply. "Not expired." He checked the date twice to be sure. Erin's throat bobbed as she swallowed. She didn't say thank you. Instead, she took the can with hands that trembled and turned away slightly, shielding the baby as she mixed a bottle with boiled water cooled in a cup. Logan respected the instinct. Privacy was a kind of control. The baby latched and quieted immediately, making small, greedy sounds that made Sophie giggle again, louder this time. Atlas's tail thumped twice. Logan carried bowls to the small table. The children ate like they'd been running from hunger as much as cold. Erin didn't eat at first. She watched them, eyes flicking from face to face, counting again. Only when she was sure they were swallowing, breathing, warming, did she take a spoonful of oatmeal. It looked like it hurt her to accept help. Logan understood that too. He moved to the window and peered out. The storm still churned, but the worst of it had shifted to a steady, relentless snow. His phone had 1 bar of service, barely. He tried a call, nothing. He texted anyway, fingers stiff. "Mrs. Patel, it's Logan. I'm home. Picked up a family in the pad, kids, need supplies when road's clear." A moment later, to his surprise, the message delivered. Atlas lifted his head as if sensing the outside world tugging at Logan again. Logan returned to the living room and found Aaron watching him now, not with the same sharp fear, but with wary calculation. "You live here alone?" she asked. "Mostly," Logan said. "Just me and Atlas." Aaron's gaze dropped to the dog. Atlas looked back, then deliberately looked away, as if he knew being stared at could feel like pressure. Aaron's shoulders eased a fraction. "Why?" she asked. And Logan knew she didn't mean the cabin. She meant the stopping, the opening of a door, the risking. Logan sat on the chair across from her, leaving space, hands open on his knees. The fire cracked softly. "Because I know what it's like to be out there," he said. "Not in a blizzard, in other storms." Aaron's mouth tightened. "You military?" Logan's jaw flexed. "Used to be." Aaron nodded as if that explained everything and nothing. The older girl finally spoke, voice low, protective. "Are you a cop?" Logan shook his head. "No, just a guy with a cabin." Aaron stared at the flames, the baby now asleep against her chest, his mouth slack with milk. When she spoke again, her voice was so quiet Logan almost missed it. "We can't stay long." Logan didn't argue. "Okay," he said, "but you can stay tonight. Storm's not letting up." Aaron's eyes lifted. There was something raw behind them now, a flash of the truth she was holding down with both hands. "If he finds us?" The words stopped there, strangled. Logan felt Atlas shift beside him, posture tightening. The dog had heard the change in Aaron's voice, the fear that wasn't about weather. Logan kept his own voice even. "Who?" Aaron's lips parted, then closed. The older girl's spoon clinked against her bowl with a tremor. Aaron looked at her children, at the way Sophie's eyelids drooped near Atlas's shoulder, at Caleb's cheeks slowly turning pink again, at the baby's steady breath. She took a long, shaky inhale. "My husband," she said at last, and the words sounded like a chain. "Derek." Logan didn't react outwardly, but inside, something cold and focused clicked into place. Atlas's ears angled forward. Aaron's eyes stayed on the fire. He's not safe," she whispered, as if naming it might summon him. "And I left. In the storm. Because it was the only time I thought he wouldn't follow." Logan's chest tightened, not with anger yet, but with the weight of knowing what came next. Papers, threats, visits in the night, the way fear didn't stop at the door just because you locked it. He stood slowly and walked to the cabinet where he kept an old radio. He switched it on, static, then a voice, faint but present. Road closures, wind warnings, a reminder that Wolf Creek Pass was impassable. Logan turned it down. "You did the right thing," he said, and he meant it. Aaron's laugh was soundless. "Right doesn't keep you alive." "Sometimes it does," Logan replied. Atlas rose and walked to Aaron. He didn't jump. He didn't lick. He sat beside her knee and leaned his shoulder gently against her leg. Just enough weight to be undeniable, not enough to trap. Aaron stiffened, then slowly, like a person stepping into warm water, she let her hand fall onto Atlas's head. Her fingers sank into the thick fur. Atlas's eyes half closed. Sophie murmured in her sleep and curled tighter against Atlas's flank, using him like a living blanket. Caleb yawned and blinked toward the hallway. The older girl watched Aaron's hand on the dog, and something in her expression shifted from suspicion to fragile curiosity. Logan felt the cabin's rhythm change, still cautious, but no longer purely fearful. He cleared his throat softly. "There's a spare room," he said. "Small, bed's old. I can make up the couch for me." Aaron's eyes snapped up. "We can take the floor." "No," Logan said, and the firmness in his tone was the kind that came from training, but he softened it immediately. "Please, let the kids have a bed." Aaron's mouth trembled, and for a moment Logan thought she might refuse on principle. Then she looked down at the baby, at Sophie's limp hand resting on Atlas's paw, at Caleb's head bobbing with sleep. "Okay," she said, and it was the smallest surrender that mattered most. Logan walked to the spare room and stripped the old quilt from the closet shelf. He shook it out, dust rising in a harmless cloud, and made the bed with military precision. When he returned, Aaron had stood, baby in her arms, and the older girl had moved closer to her side, like a shadow. "What's your name?" Logan asked the girl gently, not demanding, just offering. The girl stared at him for a long beat, then glanced at Atlas, who looked away politely again. "Hannah," she said. Logan nodded. "Hannah, I'll show you the room." He led them down the hallway. The floorboards creaked under their steps, a cabin's old bones shifting. Erin paused at the doorway. She looked at the bed like it might be a trap. Logan stepped back, giving her the frame of space again. "I'll be right out here," he said. "Atlas too, if you want him nearby." Erin's eyes flicked to the dog. Hannah spoke before Erin could. "Can he stay?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Logan's heart squeezed. "He can," Logan said. Atlas wagged once, slow and respectful, then padded into the room and lay down near the foot of the bed, positioning himself so he could see the door and the hallway, a guardian who didn't need a weapon to do his job. Erin sat on the bed carefully, as if testing whether it would disappear. The baby sighed and settled. Sophie climbed up and immediately curled against Erin's hip. Caleb crawled under the quilt without a word. Hannah stayed sitting upright, eyes open, listening to the cabin's noises like they were threats. Erin's shoulders finally sagged just a little, the first sign that she might let gravity win tonight. Logan stood at the doorframe. "I'm going to make a call when the signal comes back," he said quietly. "There's people in town who can help. Sheriff's office, a support center." Erin's eyes hardened again. "No cops." Logan didn't flinch. "Not unless you want them," he said. "But I'm not letting you go back into that storm alone." Erin's gaze held his, and for the first time there was something like anger in it, but not at him, at the world. "You don't know him," she whispered. Logan nodded once, slow. "Then I'll learn," he said. Erin looked away, jaw tight. "Don't," she said, and it sounded like a plea disguised as a warning. Logan stepped back into the living room and pulled the door mostly closed, leaving it cracked so Atlas could hear him, and he could hear them. He sat on the couch, elbows on knees, staring into the fire until the flames blurred and his mind tried to drift into older images. Sand, shouting, the smell of burning fuel. He pressed his thumb against the scar on his wrist, grounding himself. From down the hall, he heard Sophie's breathing deepen, Caleb's faint snore, Hannah's restless shift, Atlas's steady exhale, slow and even, like a metronome for survival. Logan realized with a strange ache that the cabin wasn't silent anymore, and instead of feeling invaded, he felt needed. That was the dangerous part. Outside, the wind kept clawing at the windows, but inside, a golden retriever lay like a warm line drawn between fear and rest, holding the night at bay. Morning didn't arrive so much as it seeped in. Thin gray light filtering through the storm clouds and landing softly on the cabin windows like a cautious hand. The wind had backed off during the night, trading its violent shriek for a steady, insistent hush of falling snow. Logan woke on the couch with his neck stiff and his boots still on. One hand curled around the strap of Atlas's leash like it was a lifeline. For a second, he didn't know where he was. Then he heard it, the small, ordinary sound of a child's cough down the hallway, followed by Sophie's sleepy murmur and the gentle thump of Atlas's tail against a wall. Logan sat up. The fire in the stove had settled into glowing embers, the cabin smelling of ash and oatmeal, and something new. People. Atlas padded into the living room, golden coat fluffed from sleep, and leaned his head under Logan's palm. Logan rubbed his ears automatically. "Good watch," he whispered. Atlas blinked, then angled his body toward the hallway again, as if to say the job wasn't over. It never was. Logan stoked the stove and set a kettle on to boil. Outside, the world was buried, pines bowing under heavy snow. He checked his phone. Still one shaky bar. A new text from Mrs. Patel sat on the screen like a small blessing. "On my way when the county plow reaches your road. I've got soup, bread, diapers, and extra gloves. You okay?" Logan typed back with stiff fingers. "We're safe. Thank you." Then he added, "Because it mattered. They're scared." Erin stepped into the doorway a moment later, baby on her hip, hair pulled into a loose knot that made her look younger than she had last night. Her eyes were rimmed red from exhaustion, but her posture held that same guarded straightness, like sleep had only recharged her fear. Hannah followed behind her, shoulders tense, already scanning the living room, as if she expected to catch Logan doing something wrong. Caleb shuffled out next, socked feet silent, his hunger visible in the way he sniffed the air. Sophie came last, dragging a blanket, one hand gripping Atlas's fur like a handle. Atlas allowed it with saintly patience. Erin's gaze landed on Logan, then the stove, then the kettle. "We should go," she said immediately, voice flat with urgency. Logan kept his tone calm. "Road's still closed. Radio says the pass won't open until afternoon at the earliest." Erin's jaw clenched. "We can walk." Logan's eyes flicked to the baby's tiny nose, still a shade too pale, to Caleb's chapped lips, to Sophie's thin socks. "Not in this," he said. "Not with them." Erin's gaze sharpened, but she didn't argue further. She shifted the baby higher and moved toward the small kitchen, as if keeping busy could keep panic from spilling out. Logan handed Caleb a mug of cocoa. Caleb wrapped both hands around it and sighed, like his body remembered comfort. Logan poured oatmeal again, added a spoonful of peanut butter to each bowl for calories, and slid one toward Erin. She stared at it as if it might demand something from her. Then she sat and ate 3 bites in quick succession, efficient, not savoring. Hannah ate too, but her eyes never left Logan for long. Atlas lay down in the doorway between the kitchen and the hall, occupying that space like a warm gate. Every time Erin moved, Atlas's ears followed. He wasn't watching her like a predator. He was watching her like a guardian who'd decided she was part of his pack. After breakfast, Logan pulled on his coat and stepped onto the porch. The air was quieter now, the kind of silence that comes after a storm's tantrum. Snow glowed faintly beneath the gray sky. He needed to clear the steps, check the generator, make sure the roof hadn't taken damage. Work kept his hands busy and his mind contained. Atlas followed him out, padding through the snow with ease, tail held mid-height. He circled the yard once, nose down, reading the world the way Logan read maps. Logan shoveled snow off the porch, each scrape a steady rhythm. Then he heard the cabin door creak behind him. Erin stepped out, baby bundled against her chest, shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. She didn't come to talk. She came to watch the road. Logan didn't comment. He understood the need to keep the horizon under surveillance. Atlas trotted up to Erin and sat at her feet, looking in the same direction she was. Erin's eyes flicked down to him, then away, like she didn't want to admit she found comfort there. When Logan finished, he checked the shed and found the latch half broken, likely from last night's wind. He grabbed his tools, fingers stiff in the cold, and set about repairing it. The simple mechanics of screws and hinges were soothing. It was honesty. If you tightened the bolt, it held. Human lives weren't like that. Inside the cabin, Erin moved with quiet purpose. She washed the few dishes, folded blankets, lined up the children's boots near the stove. Hannah helped in terse silence, always with one eye on the front window. Caleb hovered around Atlas, occasionally scratching behind the dog's ears when he thought Erin wasn't watching. Sophie sat on the floor near the couch, brushing Atlas's fur with her fingers, like she was trying to memorize the feeling. By mid-morning, the worst of the storm had passed, but snow still fell in thick, lazy flakes. Erin's restlessness grew. She paced once, then twice, then stopped at the hallway closet. "Do you have more blankets?" she asked. Logan wiped his hands on his jeans. "There's an old cedar chest in the spare room closet," he said. "Left by my folks, might have extra quilts." Erin nodded and disappeared down the hallway. Logan heard the closet door open, the faint scrape of wood. For a moment, there was nothing but the stove's crackle. Then, silence. The kind of silence that didn't belong. Logan turned, feeling it before he understood it. Atlas lifted his head sharply, ears forward. A low whine threaded through his throat, questioning. Logan walked down the hall. He found Erin in the spare room, kneeling on the floor beside the cedar chest. The lid was open. Her hands hovered above something inside, as if she was afraid to touch it. Hannah stood behind her, face pale, eyes wide. Caleb and Sophie peeked around the doorframe, Sophie clutching Atlas's collar for courage. In the chest lay a blanket, thick wool, worn soft with age. The pattern was intricate, a dark blue river curling between white mountains, stitched with thin lines of silver that caught the light. The edges were frayed, but the craftsmanship was unmistakable. Erin's breath came in short, shallow pulls. "Where did you get this?" she whispered. Her voice wasn't accusation yet, it was shock. Logan's stomach dropped. He hadn't seen the blanket in years. He'd shoved it into that chest like you could store guilt under a lid and call it handled. He took a step closer and recognized the exact curve of the river, the small triangular marks that indicated peaks. He remembered the weight of it on his shoulders when he'd been half dead in snow, the smell of smoke and something herbal, sage maybe, woven into the fibers. Atlas moved into the room and sat near Erin, body angled toward her, not Logan. Erin's fingers finally touched the blanket, just one corner, and her hand trembled as if the wool carried electricity. "My dad made blankets," she said, and the words came out like a confession. "He made this pattern." Hannah's eyes flicked between Erin and Logan. Logan forced his lungs to work. He could lie. He could say he bought it, found it, didn't know. But the truth had teeth. It always did. "I've had it a long time," Logan said slowly. Erin's head snapped up. Her eyes were wet now, but her face was rigid. "How long?" Logan swallowed. "Over a decade." Erin's mouth opened, then closed. The baby on her chest stirred, making a small noise, but Erin didn't look down. Her gaze locked onto Logan with a frightening clarity. "Tell me," she said. Logan's fingers went cold. He reached up and pressed his thumb against the scar at his wrist, grounding. Atlas leaned closer to Erin, a warm anchor. Logan's voice came out low. "Years ago," he began, "I was driving a mountain road in a storm, lost control, truck slid, and stopped half over a ravine." He could see it as if it was happening now, the windshield full of snow, the sound of metal bending, the sick drop in his stomach when gravity claimed him. "I was trapped," Logan continued, "leg pinned, couldn't get out." Erin didn't blink. "A man came out of the storm," Logan said. "I didn't see where from. He was strong, fast, like he knew the mountain." Logan's throat tightened. "He had that blanket. He wrapped me in it, tried to keep me warm while he pulled me free." Erin's lips parted. Hannah's hand went to her mouth. Logan's eyes dropped to the blanket, and his voice cracked in spite of him. "He got me out," he whispered, but when he tried to climb back up, the edge gave way. The words hit the room like a dropped stone. Erin inhaled sharply, and the sound was raw. Atlas whined softly, pressing his head against Erin's knee. Erin's shoulders shook once, not in sobs, but in the kind of tremor that came from a life suddenly rearranging itself. "No," she breathed. "No." Logan's chest ached. "I tried," he said, desperate to be understood, but knowing he didn't deserve it. "I reached for him. His hands flexed uselessly, remembering. The snow was coming down so hard. I couldn't see. I screamed. I fired a flare. I called for help. By the time rescue got to me," he stopped because the rest was obvious. A body in a ravine in a blizzard didn't get found easily. Erin's eyes filled, finally spilling. She looked down at the blanket, and the way her fingers gripped it said she was holding on to the only piece of her father the world had returned. "What was his name?" she asked, voice thin. Logan shook his head slowly. Shame burned behind his eyes. "I don't know," he admitted. "He never said it. I was hypothermic. I was barely conscious." Erin's face twisted with pain and anger, both sharp. "And you kept this?" she demanded, the first real heat in her voice. Logan nodded once, unable to defend himself. "I kept it because it was the only thing I had that proved he was real," Logan said. "That it wasn't a fever dream, and because—" He exhaled, the breath shaking. "Because I didn't know how to find his family, and then I did know, and I didn't." Erin's eyes narrowed. "Why?" Logan's jaw tightened until it hurt. The truth came out rough. "Because I was afraid." Hannah's eyes flashed. "Afraid of what?" she snapped. Logan looked at Hannah, and it startled him how much she sounded like Erin. "Afraid you'd look at me and see the man who lived," Logan said quietly. "Afraid you'd hate me. Afraid you'd ask why him, not me." Erin's breath hitched. Her face crumpled for half a second, grief breaking through anger. "Do you know what it's like," she whispered, "to wait and wait and wait, to keep a porch light on, even when everyone tells you to stop?" Logan's eyes stung. He nodded. "Yes," he said, and in that single word was the weight of his own waiting, for teammates who never came home, for a phone call that wouldn't ring, for a peace that never arrived. Erin rose abruptly, blanket in her hands, baby against her chest. "We're leaving," she said, voice shaking. Hannah moved instantly, stepping in front of her as if preparing to escort her out. Caleb's eyes widened. Sophie started to cry, confused. Atlas stood too, blocking the doorway for a moment, not aggressively, but as if he was asking them to pause, to breathe. Erin's gaze snapped to him. Atlas lowered his head and stepped aside, giving her the choice. That was what made it hurt. Erin walked past Logan into the hallway, boots thudding on the wood. Logan followed, heart pounding. "Erin, please." She didn't stop. She pushed the front door open, and cold air poured in. Snow swirled like a curtain. Erin stepped out onto the porch, blanket clutched tight, and stood there looking out into the white world as if she wanted to disappear into it. Logan stepped beside her, not too close. His breath smoked in the air. "I'm sorry," he said, the words useless and true. Erin's shoulders rose and fell. "Sorry doesn't give me my dad back," she whispered. Logan nodded, accepting the knife. "I know." Erin turned to face him. Her eyes were wet, shining with fury and sorrow. "You saved us last night," she said, "and you kept this, and you said nothing." Logan's voice cracked. "I didn't think I deserved to step into your life," he admitted. "But when I saw you on that road, I couldn't keep being the man who looks away." Erin stared at him for a long moment. Wind tugged at her hair. The baby whined softly against her coat. Erin's gaze shifted to the children, Hannah rigid, Caleb trembling, Sophie crying into Atlas's fur. Atlas pressed his body against Sophie, soaking up her tears like it was his purpose. Erin's jaw tightened again, practical now, maternal. "I'm not forgiving you," she said, each word measured. "Not today." Logan swallowed. "Okay." Erin's eyes didn't soften, but her voice lowered. "But my kids need warm beds. We're not walking into the snow." She turned back toward the cabin. "We stay. For now." Logan exhaled, relief and guilt mixing into something bitter. "Thank you," he whispered, though he wasn't sure he deserved even that. Erin stepped inside, and Atlas followed at her heel, not crowding her, just present. When Erin passed Logan, the blanket brushed his sleeve, and the smell of old smoke rose faintly, a ghost in wool. Logan stood on the porch a moment longer, letting the cold bite his face as punishment. Then he went back inside, closing the door against the storm. The cabin was warm. The truth was not. But for the first time, it was out in the open, and Atlas, steady, golden, patient, moved between them like a bridge made of breath and loyalty. By late afternoon, the sky had turned the reminder color of old steel, and the snow, no longer a frantic whiteout, fell in thick, heavy flakes that made the world feel muted, as if sound itself had been wrapped in cotton. Logan had spent the day doing the kind of work that kept his hands steady, fixing the shed latch, clearing the porch, stacking split logs in a neat line, like order could be built one piece at a time. Erin had stayed mostly inside, moving through the cabin with a restrained urgency, checking on the children, counting supplies, counting breaths. Hannah watched the windows more than she watched cartoons on Logan's dusty old TV. Caleb sat cross-legged on the rug, whispering secrets into Atlas's golden ear, as if the dog was the safest person in the room. Sophie followed Atlas like a shadow with mittens, and when the baby fussed, Atlas would sit near Erin's knee, close enough for her to feel his warmth without feeling trapped. The tension from the blanket confession hadn't left. It had simply settled into new shape, like ice refreezing after being cracked. Logan felt it in the way Erin avoided his eyes, in the way she spoke only when necessary, in the way her voice thinned when the wind hit the window just right. He could live with her anger. What he couldn't live with was the fear that kept blooming behind it. It was Atlas who heard the new sound first. Logan was in the kitchen rinsing a coffee mug when Atlas's head snapped up, ears forward, body going perfectly still. Not the relaxed stillness of a dog dozing, the working stillness of a dog listening for the moment before a door kicks in. Atlas's nostrils flared once, 2 quick pulls. Then he trotted to the front window and stood there, tail low, gaze fixed on the swirling white beyond the glass. Logan's stomach tightened. Erin, in the hallway, froze mid-step. Hannah was already moving, instinctively gathering Sophie close, her hand finding Caleb's shoulder like a clamp. "What is it?" Erin whispered, The question aimed at no one and everyone. Atlas gave a single low woof, the kind he'd been trained to use as an alert, controlled, not panicked. Logan crossed to the window and peered out. At first he saw only snow and pine shadows. Then headlights swung into the drive, bright and harsh, washing over the porch like an interrogation lamp. A truck rolled into view, black, polished, too clean for mountain roads. It didn't creep. It advanced with the confidence of someone who believed the land would move out of his way. Behind it, a second set of lights appeared, a county vehicle, white with a green stripe, tires crunching slow, careful, official. Aaron's breath hitched, and the baby gave a small, startled whine. "No," Aaron said, and the word sounded like it had teeth. Logan turned, voice low but firm. "Take the kids to the back room," he said. Aaron didn't argue this time. She moved fast, gathering the baby, guiding Caleb and Sophie by their sleeves while Hannah kept her chin up, trying to look older than 12. Atlas followed them in 2 steps, then stopped and looked back at Logan, eyes bright. Logan held Atlas's gaze for a beat, then nodded once. "Stay close," he murmured. Atlas returned to Logan's side like he'd been called by gravity. Logan checked the deadbolt and slid the chain into place. He didn't grab a weapon. There wasn't one to grab. He'd made that choice years ago when he realized living with a loaded gun in a cabin wasn't bravery. It was a bad night waiting to happen. Instead, he opened the inner door just enough to see through the glass storm door, keeping the barrier between them. The black truck door swung open, and a man stepped out who looked like he'd built himself out of anger and habit. Derek was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair shaved tight at the sides and longer on top, damp from snow. His face might have been handsome in another life, but resentment had carved deep grooves at the corners of his mouth, and his eyes held the sharp, suspicious glare of someone who always needed to win. He wore a heavy work jacket and jeans, but his posture screamed possession more than practicality. He stared at the cabin like it belonged to him. Then he grinned when he saw Logan through the glass. "There you are," Derek called, voice carrying through the storm with an ugly ease. "Thought you could hide her up here." He took a step toward the porch, boots stamping snow, and Atlas moved, silent, immediate, placing himself between Logan and the door, body squared, head up, tail still. Not lunging, not barking, just present in a way that made the air feel smaller. Derek's gaze flicked down to the golden retriever, and he scoffed. "Cute dog," he said, like kindness could be a weapon too. The county vehicle behind him opened, and a deputy climbed out, young, maybe late 20s, with a thick winter hat and a face that looked unsure about how he'd ended up in this scene. He walked a half step behind Derek, eyes scanning the cabin and then the road, like he wished he were anywhere else. Logan recognized the type. Someone asked to just come along. Someone told a story that sounded tidy in an office and wrong in snow. "Can I help you?" Logan asked through the door, keeping his voice steady. Derek pointed at the cabin. "My wife is inside. My kids are inside. You're going to open that door and let them out." Logan didn't rise to the bait. "If your wife wants to leave with you, she can tell me that herself," he replied. Derek's grin faltered, replaced by a hard stare. "She doesn't get to decide," Derek snapped, then caught himself and smoothed his expression like he'd practiced it in front of a mirror. He turned slightly toward the deputy. "Tell him," Derek said loudly. "She's unstable. She ran off in a storm. She's stealing my children." The deputy shifted his weight, uncomfortable. "Sir," the deputy began, "we need to speak to—" "She doesn't talk to strangers," Derek cut in, then looked back at Logan, voice dropping into a mock-friendly drawl. "Listen, man, I don't know what kind of hero fantasy you're living out here, but this is family business." Logan felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his tone even. "Family business doesn't look like kids walking through a blizzard," he said. Atlas's lip lifted for half a second, not a snarl, a warning, and Logan quietly placed his hand on Atlas's collar, not restraining, just grounding. Derek's eyes narrowed. "Oh, she told you a story?" he said. "You believe whatever she says? That's adorable." The deputy glanced toward his vehicle as if hoping for backup, and then it arrived, another set of headlights, slower, heavier, pulling into the drive with the steady authority of someone who didn't need to rush to be dangerous. A larger county SUV stopped behind the deputy. The driver's door opened, and a woman stepped out wearing a sheriff's jacket that fit her like it had grown there. Sheriff Nora Bennett was in her early 40s, athletic and compact, with weather-toughened skin and a reminder of kindness in the lines around her eyes. Her dark hair was pulled into a tight braid tucked under a cap. She walked through the snow with the sure footing of someone who'd spent a lifetime on bad roads. Her gaze landed on Derek first, then shifted to Logan, then to Atlas, who held his stance without a sound. "Evening," Bennett called, voice calm but not soft. "Who's making trouble in my county?" Derek's face brightened instantly into performative relief. "Sheriff, thank God," he said, stepping forward like he owned the narrative. "My wife took off with my kids. This guy," he jabbed a finger at the cabin, "picked her up and won't let her out. I want my family back." Sheriff Bennett's eyes didn't widen. They didn't flinch. They simply observed, sharp and quiet. "And your wife's name?" "Aaron Whitlock," Derek said too fast, as if he'd been waiting to say it. Logan felt Aaron's presence behind him before he heard her. The hallway floorboard creaked, and Aaron's voice came from the dim interior, controlled but shaking at the edges. "It's Aaron," she said, "and I'm not going with him." Logan's chest tightened. Sheriff Bennett lifted her chin slightly. "Aaron," she repeated, and something in her tone made it a lifeline, rather than a command. "Can you come to the door where I can see you?" Logan unlatched the chain, but kept the door mostly closed, opening it just enough for Aaron to step into view while still sheltered by the frame. Aaron appeared holding the baby, shoulders squared, eyes rimmed red with exhaustion. Behind her, Hannah hovered like a sentry, and Atlas shifted his body half an inch so he was still between Aaron and Derek, without blocking Aaron's view of the sheriff. Aaron's hand trembled on the baby's back. Sheriff Bennett's gaze moved over Aaron with clinical care. The tightness in her shoulders, the way she positioned the baby as a shield, the faint discoloration at her wrist visible where her sleeve had ridden up. It was old bruising, yellowing at the edges, but it was there. Derek saw the sheriff looking and immediately stepped forward. "She's dramatic," he said. "She bruises easy. She's been—" "Stop talking," Sheriff Bennett said, not loud, not angry, just final. Derek's mouth snapped shut in shock. Bennett addressed Aaron again. "Aaron, are you afraid of your husband?" Aaron's throat bobbed. Logan felt Atlas's muscles tense under his hand, as if the dog could hear Aaron's fear rising like a wave. Aaron didn't look at Derek. She looked at the sheriff. "Yes," she said. It was one syllable, and it changed everything. Derek laughed sharp and brittle. "Come on," he scoffed. "Afraid? I've never touched—" "On stop!" Bennett said again, and this time there was steel under the calm. She turned to the deputy. "You hear that?" The deputy nodded slowly, eyes flicking from Derek to Aaron with new uncertainty. Sheriff Bennett stepped closer to the porch, stopping at the bottom step so she wasn't crowding Aaron. "Aaron," she said, voice softer now, "I'm going to ask you a few questions. You can answer yes or no. You can tell me more if you want, but you don't have to do anything you're not ready for." Aaron's grip tightened on the baby. "Okay. Did you leave because you believed you or your children were in danger?" Aaron's voice barely carried. "Yes." "Did you run into the storm to get away?" "Yes." Sheriff Bennett nodded once, as if confirming what she already knew from the way Aaron stood. Then Bennett looked past Aaron into the cabin. "Are the kids okay right now?" Aaron hesitated. Hannah stepped forward half a step, chin lifted. "They're warm," Hannah said, fierce. "They're safe." Atlas's tail thumped once, slow, like he agreed. Sheriff Bennett's gaze softened at Hannah's courage, then hardened again when she turned back to Derek. "Sir," she said, "you're not taking anyone anywhere tonight." Derek's face flushed, anger surging up like a tide. "You can't do that," he snapped. "Those are my kids." Bennett's voice stayed even. "Tonight, they're with their mother, and I'm opening a domestic violence report based on Aaron's statement and what I'm observing." Derek stepped forward, and Atlas barked once, one sharp, clean bark, then planted his feet. Logan didn't have to say a word. Atlas had made the boundary visible. Derek stopped short, glaring at the dog like he wanted to hit something, but knew too many eyes were watching. Sheriff Bennett's hand moved subtly toward her radio. "Mr. Whitlock," she continued, "you'll return to town. There will be an emergency protective order request filed as soon as the courthouse opens. You will not approach this property again. Do you understand?" Ew. Derek's nostrils flared. This is a joke, he said. She's with a stranger, a vet bro playing soldier. Logan felt heat rise in his chest, but he swallowed it down. Sheriff Bennett's gaze flicked to Logan. Name? Logan Pierce, Logan answered. I picked them up on the pass. They would have frozen. You got a record? Bennett asked, brisk, professional. No, Logan said. Former Navy, honorably discharged. Bennett gave a small nod. Not approval, not condemnation, just information filed. She turned back to Derek. You're done here, she said. Derek's eyes burned into Aaron. You'll regret this, he hissed, and for a second, the mask slipped enough that the threat showed its teeth. Aaron didn't flinch, but Logan felt her body go rigid. Atlas leaned into Aaron's shin again, silent pressure, and Aaron's fingers found the dog's fur like a rail. Sheriff Bennett's voice sharpened. That's a threat, she said. Deputy, escort him to his vehicle, now. The deputy moved quickly this time, stepping between Derek and the porch, gesturing toward the truck. Derek shoved past him, spitting curses under his breath, and slammed the truck door so hard snow fell from the pines in a soft shower. His tires spun as he backed out, spraying slush, the truck's red taillights shrinking into the snowfall like angry embers. The deputy followed, then paused to look back once, his expression uneasy, as if he'd just realized he'd been used. Sheriff Bennett remained, her posture easing just a fraction as the immediate threat left. She glanced at Aaron. Do you have somewhere safe to go after tonight? Aaron's mouth opened, then closed. The truth was brutal. Safe didn't exist the way it should. Aaron looked down at the baby, then at Hannah behind her, then at Atlas sitting like a golden pillar beside the doorway. Here, Aaron said finally, and the words sounded like surrender and strategy at the same time. Sheriff Bennett nodded, accepting it. All right, she said. I'll check in tomorrow morning. And Aaron, if he shows up again, you call. You don't negotiate. You don't open the door. Aaron's eyes flicked to Logan, then away. Okay. Bennett's gaze shifted briefly to Atlas, and a faint, human softness touched her mouth. Good dog, she said quietly. Atlas's tail thumped once. Yeah, Logan felt a strange tightness in his throat at how much that small acknowledgement mattered. Sheriff Bennett tipped her cap toward Logan. You did the right thing stopping, she said, then her eyes sharpened again, practical. Now, do the right thing next. Document everything you saw, dates, times, road conditions. I'll need it for court. Logan nodded. I will. Sheriff Bennett left, her SUV crunching down the drive until the sound faded into snow. The cabin returned to stillness, but it was different now, charged, like the air after lightning. Aaron stood in the doorway for a long time, eyes fixed on the empty road, as if daring it to send Derek back. Hannah's hand hovered near the deadbolt. Caleb pressed his face against Atlas's shoulder, seeking warmth and courage in the same place. Sophie reached for Aaron's sleeve, small fingers trembling. Aaron finally turned inward, stepping back into the cabin, and the door closed with a decisive click. Logan slid the deadbolt into place and rested his forehead against the wood for a second, breathing. Atlas sat beside him, steady, golden, unwavering. Aaron's voice came out low behind him. He'll come again, she said. Logan didn't pretend otherwise. He turned to face her, keeping his posture open. Then we'll be ready, he replied, and Atlas's tail thumped once more, like punctuation, like a promise written in warmth, not bravado. The next morning dawned clean and cold, the kind of winter brightness that made every breath feel like it had edges. Snow still covered the driveway in soft drifts, but the county plow had finally carved a narrow path down the mountain road, leaving tall walls of white on either side like a corridor. Logan stood on the porch with a mug of coffee cooling in his hands, watching Aaron buckle the baby into an old car seat Mrs. Patel had insisted on bringing up at sunrise. Mrs. Patel, small, brisk, silver-haired, wrapped in a quilted coat the color of cranberries, had filled the cabin with practical kindness before anyone could refuse it. She'd laid out bread and soup and diapers like she was stocking a lifeboat, then produced a neat folder of printed resources from the Pagosa Springs Family Support Center, as if she'd been waiting her whole life to do it. You don't have to decide everything today, she'd told Aaron, voice gentle but firm. You just have to show up. Showing up changes what's possible. Aaron had nodded without really nodding, jaw set, eyes sleepless. Hannah had hovered at the window until the sheriff's cruiser pulled into the drive. Sheriff Nora Bennett stepped out, steady as ever, and spoke to Aaron on the porch in a voice meant for only one person to hear. Logan didn't catch the words, but he caught Aaron's shoulders lowering a fraction, like the world had shifted from pure chaos into a path with markers. "Courthouse at 9, Bennett said when she turned to Logan. "Dress warm, bring your notes, and bring the dog if that's what keeps those kids steady." Atlas, as if he understood the invitation, trotted to Aaron's side and sat, looking up at her with patient attention. Aaron didn't pet him at first. Then, like she was allowing herself one small anchor, her fingers slid into his fur behind his ear and stayed there. The drive into town felt longer than the miles. Logan kept both hands on the wheel, eyes scanning the road with the old habit of checking for threats that didn't belong here. Aaron sat in the passenger seat this time, baby asleep against her chest, her borrowed wool coat buttoned wrong because her hands had been shaking when she did it. Hannah sat behind Aaron, spine straight, watching the world pass by, as if she didn't trust it to stay quiet. Caleb leaned into Atlas's side in the back seat, his mittened hand gripping the dog's harness strap. Sophie kept whispering to Atlas, telling him the names of things she saw outside, trees, deer tracks, a frozen creek, like naming the world made it less scary. Atlas stayed between them all, golden and still, occasionally turning his head to check Aaron's face the way he'd been trained to check a handler's breathing. In town, the courthouse looked like every small mountain courthouse Logan had ever seen. Brick, square, a flag snapping hard in the wind. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and floor polish and wet wool. Aaron froze at the threshold, eyes darting toward the hallway, like the building itself might contain Derek in its walls. Atlas stepped forward and then paused, turning his head back toward her, waiting, not pulling, not forcing, offering the choice. Aaron exhaled and followed. A bailiff stopped them at the entrance to the courtroom, his gaze dropping to the dog. "No animals," he began automatically. Sheriff Bennett appeared at his shoulder like she'd been summoned by the word no. "He's a registered support and SAR dog," she said, flashing a small card Logan had never seen but was grateful existed. "And those kids don't separate from him today." The bailiff hesitated, then looked at Aaron's pale face and the baby's tiny hands peeking from the blanket. His expression softened. "All right," he muttered, "but he stays quiet." Atlas sat immediately, as if demonstrating he'd been born for quiet. They found seats in the second row. Aaron sat at the aisle, Hannah beside her like a sentry. Caleb and Sophie tucked in close. Atlas lay down at their feet, chin on his paws, eyes open. Logan sat one row behind, not because he wanted distance, but because he knew Aaron needed space to own her own story. Mrs. Patel slid into the bench next to Logan with a supportive squeeze on his forearm, then nodded at a man approaching from the hallway. "That's Mason," she whispered. "He runs the Veteran Outreach and Therapy Dog program through the community center." Mason Reed was about Logan's age, maybe late 30s, with a calm face that looked like it had learned to hold other people's pain without flinching. He wore a navy pea coat over jeans, and his hair was cut short in the practical way of men who didn't trust mirrors. When he smiled, it was tired but genuine. He held a paper cup of coffee in one hand and a thick folder in the other. "Pierce," Mason said quietly, offering his hand. "Heard you found yourself a blizzard problem." Logan shook his hand. Mason's grip was firm, familiar. "More like it found me," Logan replied. Mason's gaze flicked to Aaron and the kids, then to Atlas. "Good boy," Mason murmured. Atlas's tail tapped once on the floor, almost imperceptible. Mason crouched near the bench and spoke to Aaron without crowding her. "Aaron, I'm Mason," he said. "I'm not law enforcement. I'm here to make sure you're not alone in the paperwork part. Sheriff Bennett asked me to connect you to an advocate." Aaron's eyes narrowed at the word advocate, like it might be another trap. Mason opened his folder and slid a single card across the bench. "Her name is Lila Torres," he said. "She's with the Family Support Center. She'll explain what's happening before anyone asks you questions." Aaron stared at the card a long moment, then slipped it into her pocket without saying thank you. Logan understood. Gratitude could feel like debt when you'd been controlled for years. The courtroom doors opened, and Derek walked in like he owned the building. He wore a pressed flannel and clean boots, hair neatly styled, the careful costume of a man trying to look reasonable. 2 deputies followed him, one of them the younger officer from the cabin. Derek's eyes found Aaron instantly. His mouth curled into a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. Aaron's hand tightened on the baby. Hannah's shoulders rose as if she could make herself bigger. Atlas lifted his head. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He simply watched Derek with an unblinking, steady focus that made Derek's smile falter for half a second. Derek's gaze dropped to the dog, irritation flashing through his features. He looked away too quickly, as if refusing to acknowledge a boundary he couldn't bulldoze. A woman in a charcoal coat approached Aaron's bench. Lila Torres, the advocate Mason had mentioned. She was in her early 30s, with dark curls pinned back, warm brown eyes, and a voice that didn't rush. "Aaron?" she asked softly. Aaron nodded once. Lila crouched so she was eye level with Aaron and spoke in short, clear sentences. "This is an emergency protective order hearing and a temporary custody matter," she said. "You answer only what you're asked. If you need a break, you tell me. If you feel unsafe, you look at Sheriff Bennett and say so. You're doing the right thing." Aaron's throat moved as she swallowed. Atlas shifted closer, his shoulder pressing lightly against Aaron's boot. Aaron's fingers slid down and rested on his head like she was holding onto a railing. A clerk called the case. The judge entered, a woman with silver blonde hair in a tight bun and sharp eyes that had seen every flavor of small-town tragedy. Judge Maren Holloway didn't look impressed by anyone. She looked attentive. "Ms. Whitlock," she said, voice steady. "Mr. Whitlock, we are here to determine immediate safety and temporary custody pending further proceedings." Her gaze swept the room and paused on Atlas. The judge's brow lifted. Sheriff Bennett stepped forward. "Your Honor, the children have been through a severe incident. The dog is a trained search and rescue animal and support presence." Judge Holloway studied Aaron's face for a long moment. Then she nodded once. "He may stay," she said. Derek scoffed loudly. "So we're bringing pets into court now?" Judge Holloway's eyes snapped to him. "Mr. Whitlock," she said, calm as ice, "you will speak when it is your turn, and you will speak with respect. Do we understand each other?" Derek's mouth tightened. "Yes, Your Honor." Aaron's turn came first. She stood with the baby held close, hands trembling just enough that Hannah rose too, like she might steady her mother if she swayed. Lila placed a gentle hand near Aaron's elbow, without touching unless invited. Aaron began in a voice barely above a whisper. She talked about leaving in the storm. She talked about Derek's temper, the way it rose over small things, spilled milk, a child's laughter too loud, a question he didn't like. She didn't dramatize. That was what made it devastating. She described the night she decided she would rather face a mountain blizzard than another winter in that house. When she faltered, her eyes flicked down to Atlas. Atlas looked back at her, then blinked slowly, one of the calming signals dogs used when the world felt too sharp. Aaron's breath matched that slow blink. She continued. Sheriff Bennett testified next, describing what she observed at the cabin. Aaron's fear, the children clustering behind her, the older child's protective stance, the faint bruising on Aaron's wrist, and Derek's behavior when he arrived. The younger deputy spoke too, hesitantly at first, then with more certainty. "Mr. Whitlock was aggressive," he admitted. "He tried to control the conversation. The kids appeared afraid." Derek's face reddened as if shame was a personal insult. When it was Derek's turn, he stood with performative outrage. "She's unstable," he declared, pointing at Aaron like she was a broken object. "She kidnapped my children. She's sleeping at a stranger's cabin. That man," he jabbed a finger toward Logan, "is a veteran with issues, and he's using my wife's imagination to play hero." Logan felt his muscles tighten, old instincts flaring, but he stayed seated. This wasn't his battle to swing. Aaron's shoulders stiffened, Hannah's jaw clenched. Caleb shrank, and Sophie's eyes filled with tears. Atlas rose silently and stepped forward just enough to place his body between the children and Derek's pointing hand. He didn't challenge. He shielded. That small movement steadied the kids. Caleb's hand found Atlas's harness again. Judge Holloway watched it all with a face that gave nothing away. Then she asked Derek one question, simple and surgical. "Mr. Whitlock," she said, "do you understand that an emergency protective order, if granted, means you do not approach your wife or your children until the court says otherwise? Derek's smile returned, brittle. Your Honor, that's unnecessary. I'm their father. Judge Holloway's eyes narrowed. That was not my question. Derek hesitated. The silence stretched. Yes, he said finally, irritation seeping through the word. Judge Holloway looked down at her papers, then back up at Aaron. Ms. Whitlock, she said, you have presented credible concern for your safety and the safety of the children. Based on testimony and observed behavior, I am granting an emergency protective order effective immediately. Aaron's knees visibly weakened, and Hannah grabbed her elbow. Temporary custody remains with Ms. Whitlock, the judge continued. Mr. Whitlock, you will have no contact pending further evaluation and hearing dates. If you violate this order, you will be arrested. Derek's face twisted, rage flashing like a match struck in dry grass. He opened his mouth, but Judge Holloway's gavel cracked once, sharp and final. We are done, she said. Bailiff. Derek's shoulders heaved as he stared at Aaron with a look that promised trouble later. Atlas met that look without blinking. Derek looked away first. Outside the courthouse, sunlight hit the snow so hard it hurt the eyes. Aaron stood on the steps, baby against her chest, breathing as if she'd just surfaced from deep water. Lila handed her a packet of papers. This is protection, she said, and this is a plan, housing options, counseling, legal aid. You don't have to use all of it today. Mason offered Logan a ride-along contact for the community center. We've got a pantry, he said, and winter coats, and if you need to install cameras or lights, there's volunteers. Mrs. Patel hugged Sophie gently, and Sophie hugged back without hesitation, as if her body recognized safe people now. Erin didn't cry, she simply looked at her children, Hannah holding her head higher than yesterday, Caleb clutching his cocoa thermos, Sophie's mittened hand buried in Atlas's fur, and she let out one long breath that looked like relief. Logan walked with them to the truck, staying half a step behind. Erin paused before climbing in. She looked at Logan, then down at Atlas. He helped, she said quietly, and her hand brushed Atlas's head in a way that was almost tender. Logan nodded. He does that, he replied. Erin's eyes lifted again, and for the first time since the blanket, the anger in her gaze wasn't the only thing there. There was fear still. Derek's stare had planted that. But there was also a thin thread of resolve, like something in her had decided to live loudly. As they drove back up the mountain, Atlas sat upright between the kids, golden silhouette against the bright snow, watching the road ahead, as if he could see the next storm before it formed. Logan suspected he could, and Logan knew the judge's papers were not a magic shield. They were a start. The real work, the building of safety, the building of a home that didn't flinch, was waiting for them in the quiet pines. The cabin changed in small, stubborn ways after the courthouse, like a body relearning how to unclench. Logan didn't say, "We're safe now," because he'd learned that safety wasn't a switch you flipped. It was something you built with boards and routines and witnesses. He started with light. The first evening back, while Erin fed the baby by the stove and Hannah watched the windows with her jaw set, Logan climbed a ladder and screwed in 2 motion sensor floodlights above the porch. The beams cut through the dusk like calm, white lines. No drama, no warning sirens, just visibility. Atlas stayed below, golden head tilted upward, tracking Logan's movements the way he tracked a search grid, then turning his gaze to the tree line whenever wind stirred a branch. Erin didn't ask permission, and Logan didn't offer it. They both moved around the unspoken truth that the paper in Erin's pocket, the emergency protective order, was only as strong as what they did with it. Mrs. Patel arrived the next morning with a trunk full of practical love, a used baby monitor still in its box, pantry staples, and a small spiral notebook. She set the notebook on the kitchen table like it was sacred. "Write everything," she told Logan, tapping the cover. "Dates, times, what he said, what you saw, weather, license plates, judges love details." Logan nodded, and Erin's eyes flicked to the notebook with something like dread, because recording the truth meant admitting it was real. Atlas padded over, sniffed the notebook once, then sat beside Erin's chair and pressed his shoulder into her shin. Erin's fingers slid into his fur without thinking, as if Atlas had become the only thing in the room her body trusted automatically. Mason Reed came up the following afternoon with 2 volunteers from the community center, people who looked like they belonged in a hardware store aisle. Work gloves, knit caps, steady eyes. Mason's voice stayed low and practical, the way it always did when he was offering help that might feel like pity if he said it wrong. "We're not here to take over," he told Aaron on the porch. "We're here to make it harder for fear to get in." One volunteer, a compact woman named Jules Kim with a tool belt slung over her coat, walked the perimeter with Logan and pointed out blind spots like she was mapping a problem with compassion. They installed a simple camera over the driveway and a second one aimed at the back path near the woodpile. Nothing fancy, just a pair of watchful electronic eyes that didn't sleep. Atlas followed every step, nose down in the snow, then lifting his head to look at Aaron whenever a hammer strike sounded too sharp. When Sophie flinched at a sudden clang, Atlas immediately moved to her, leaning his warm chest against her legs until her breathing slowed. Logan saw it and felt something loosen inside him. The dog wasn't just guarding the property, he was teaching the children how to come back from panic. That evening, Mason called from town with an idea that wasn't charity dressed up in a bow. "We're hosting a winter community night at the rec center," he said. "Coats, food pantry, and a fundraiser for the family support center. Erin can stay anonymous if she wants, but if she's willing to contribute something, anything, it can turn this from rescue into momentum." Erin had been folding laundry by the stove, and she paused like she'd been struck by the word momentum. She didn't want to be a story people whispered about, but she also didn't want other mothers to walk into storms alone. She looked down at the old blanket pattern spread across her lap, the river curling between mountains, the design that had cracked her open. And then she looked at her children, Hannah learning to unbraid fear from her shoulders one breath at a time, Caleb laughing softly when Atlas tried to steal a sock, Sophie tracing Atlas's paw pads like they were lucky stones, the baby sleeping deeper now, no longer jerking awake at every gust. "I can make something small," Aaron said quietly. "Not a speech." "No speeches," Mason promised. "Just presence." Over the next 2 days, Aaron stitched late into the night at Logan's kitchen table, needle flashing under the lamplight. She used scraps Mrs. Patel had brought, denim, flannel, an old blue shirt Logan hadn't worn since before the fire, and she sewed palm-sized quilt squares with a river and mountain motif simplified into bold lines. Atlas lay at her feet while she worked, occasionally lifting his head to nudge her ankle when her shoulders crept too high. Each time, Aaron would exhale, drop her shoulders, and keep stitching. Logan repaired the back fence and replaced the porch latch with a solid deadbolt, his hands moving with the calm precision of a man who needed tangible results. At night, he sat on the porch steps and listened, the baby's soft sighs through the monitor, Sophie's murmurs in sleep, Hannah's restless shift, Caleb's occasional cough. Atlas would sit beside him, head turned toward the dark, ears flicking to every small sound, and Logan would find himself matching the dog's steady breathing like it was a borrowed skill. The community night happened on a Saturday when the sun was bright enough to make the snow sparkle. Erin didn't go into the rec center like she belonged there. She went in like she was crossing a boundary line. Lila Torres met them at the door and didn't ask Erin to smile or be brave. She simply said, "I'm glad you came," and guided them toward a table near the wall where Erin could see the exits. Mason kept the event moving, coats handed out, hot chili steaming, a raffle basket on the counter, while Mrs. Patel acted like everyone's stern aunt, making sure people signed up to drive meals to the shelter and not just clap about it. Erin placed her stitched quilt squares on the table with a small handwritten note. "For anyone rebuilding, you are not alone." Atlas sat at Hannah's knee and let strangers admire him from a respectful distance. His calm drew people in without forcing anything. Sophie beamed when someone called Atlas handsome, and for once Hannah didn't correct her or hush her. She just let the compliment exist. By the end of the night, Mason quietly told Logan they'd raised enough to cover several families' emergency motel stays and legal filing fees. Erin didn't cry. She just stared at the number, then looked down at her children as if trying to understand how her pain had just turned into shelter for someone else. On the drive back up the mountain, Logan glanced at Erin and saw something new in her profile. Not peace, not yet, but direction. He wanted to say something that wasn't clumsy, something that didn't sound like a soldier giving orders. Instead, he let the truck's warmth speak and kept his focus on the road, trusting Atlas to do what Atlas always did, keep the center steady. The violation happened 3 nights later, on a Sunday when the sky was so clear it felt suspicious. Logan was outside stacking firewood, breath puffing in slow clouds, when Atlas abruptly froze mid-step. The golden retriever's head lifted. His ears angled forward, then back, then forward again, triangulating. His nose worked in quick pulls, and a low control sound gathered in his chest. Logan straightened, axe still in his hand, but held low, not raised. "What do you have?" he murmured. Atlas didn't look at Logan. He stared toward the tree line behind the yard, where the snow lay smooth except for a few deer tracks. Except, Logan realized with a cold drop in his stomach, there was another set of marks too close to the fence. Human. Fresh. Atlas moved first, trotting, not running, toward the back path, then stopping and looking over his shoulder at Logan like a command. Follow. Logan's pulse kicked into a familiar cadence. He set the axe down and moved quietly, boots crunching just enough to remind him the world here was loud in ways that mattered. Inside the cabin, Aaron was changing the baby on a blanket near the stove, while Sophie and Caleb played with a deck of worn cards. Hannah had been sent outside for fresh air, Aaron's attempt at normal. Logan had agreed because Hannah had stayed within the yard, with Atlas as her shadow. Until now. Logan rounded the corner of the cabin and saw Hannah near the edge of the fence line, kneeling by a drift as if she had dropped something. A shape moved behind a pine. Atlas barked once, sharp, clean, a warning that snapped through the cold. Hannah startled and stood, turning toward Atlas with confusion. Then Derek stepped out of the trees like he'd been poured from shadow, one gloved hand extended toward Hannah. "Hey!" he said, voice syrupy, the fake kindness he used when he needed something. "Come on, I'm taking you home. Your mom's sick." Hannah froze, eyes wide, caught between old fear and new rules. Logan's blood ran hot, but he forced his feet to stay measured. Atlas got there first. The golden retriever placed his body between Derek and Hannah, square stance, head up, tail still. He didn't bite. He didn't lunge. He simply became a wall that breathed. Derek's expression twisted when he saw the dog. "Move!" Derek snarled, and he reached down as if to grab Hannah's arm around Atlas's shoulder. Atlas snapped his head forward and barked again, louder, and then, only when Derek's hand kept coming, Atlas grabbed the cuff of Derek's glove with a firm, controlled bite and pulled away. Not tearing, not shaking, just redirecting. Derek cursed and yanked back, stumbling a step. Hannah used the opening like a door and bolted toward Logan, who caught her by the shoulders and pulled her behind him. "Inside," Logan said, voice low but absolute. Hannah's breath came in frantic bursts, but she obeyed, sprinting for the porch. Aaron appeared in the doorway at the sound, baby clutched to her chest, her face draining of color as her eyes locked onto Derek. "You're not allowed here," she whispered, the words both prayer and warning. Derek's gaze flicked to her, and his smile returned, ugly and familiar. "Paper doesn't scare me," he said. "You think a judge can keep me from my family?" Logan stepped forward, keeping himself between Derek and the cabin. Atlas stayed at his left thigh, posture rigid but controlled, golden fur bristling along the shoulders. "Sheriff's on the way," Logan said, and he didn't bluff, because the camera above the driveway had already pinged his phone with motion when Derek's truck stopped down the road. And Logan had hit the emergency call button Mason had insisted he set up. Derek's eyes narrowed. He glanced toward the road like he could outrun consequences if he moved fast enough. "You did this," he spat at Aaron. "You're poisoning them." Aaron's hands trembled, but her voice held. "No," she said, and it came out stronger than she expected. "You did." Atlas's tail lifted slightly, not wagging, just steady, as if he recognized the moment she claimed her truth out loud. Sirens weren't dramatic in the mountains. They were distant, growing slowly. But when Derek heard them, his bravado fractured. He backed away, cursing, then turned as if to disappear into the trees again. Atlas took 2 steps forward, barking once more, not chasing, only marking Derek's retreat, making sure he didn't circle back toward the kids. Sheriff Bennett's cruiser arrived a minute later, tires crunching hard, lights flashing against the snow. She got out fast, hand near her radio, eyes sharp. When she saw Derek, she didn't ask for explanations. "Mr. Whitlock," she called, voice slicing clean through the air. "You're in violation of an active emergency protective order." Derek tried to protest, to perform, but the deputy behind Bennett already had cuffs out. Derek's gaze burned into Aaron one last time, full of poison. Aaron didn't look away. Atlas stood beside her, golden and solid, and Hannah pressed her face into Atlas's neck, shaking. Bennett approached Aaron more gently. "You okay?" she asked. Aaron nodded once, the motion small and fierce. "He tried to take her," Aaron said, and her voice finally cracked. "He tried." Bennett's jaw tightened. "Not today," she said. "Not again." The deputies led Derek to the cruiser. As the door shut on his rage, the yard went quiet in a way that felt like a door closing in Aaron's chest, too. Maybe not forever, but for now. Logan crouched beside Atlas and checked his mouth, fingers gentle along the dog's jowls, making sure there was no blood, no torn tooth. Atlas licked Logan's wrist once, warm, reassuring, like he was saying, "I did my job." Logan's throat tightened. "Good boy," he whispered, and this time the words weren't just praise. They were gratitude so sharp it ached. Later, after Bennett left with Derek in custody and the cameras blinked their steady red lights, the cabin held a different kind of quiet. Aaron sat on the couch with the baby asleep against her, Hannah tucked under her arm. Caleb and Sophie curled on the rug with Atlas between them like a living hearth. Logan stood by the window, watching the dark, and felt a strange, unfamiliar thing settle into his bones. Not peace, not yet, but the certainty that he wasn't standing alone at the edge of the storm anymore. This house, patched and imperfect, had learned to breathe, and Atlas, golden and steady, had taught them all how to inhale without flinching. The morning Derek was taken away, the mountain air felt different, still cold, still sharp, but no longer charged with the same invisible electricity. It wasn't that fear vanished, fear didn't vanish. It learned new rules. It learned to sit in a corner and watch while life kept moving. Logan understood that kind of change. He watched it happen in the smallest things. Hannah stepping onto the porch without scanning every tree first. Caleb laughing loud enough that it echoed off the snowbanks. Sophie skipping with mittens flapping like flags. And Aaron letting her shoulders drop for an entire minute without catching herself. Atlas stayed at the center of it all, not like a mascot, but like gravity. He checked the fence line each morning, nose tracing the same routes, then returned to the cabin and leaned into whichever child needed him most. When Aaron woke with the baby crying and her hands shaking, Atlas would press his head against her knee until her breathing slowed. When Logan's mind tried to drag him back to older battlegrounds, Atlas would nudge his wrist, a soft reminder that the present had weight too. Sheriff Nora Bennett came by that afternoon with paperwork and a new kind of steadiness in her eyes. "He's being held," she told Aaron, tone clipped with professional certainty. Violation of the order, attempted interference, and the county's taking it seriously. Judge Holloway signed an updated no contact. This one is clear enough a toddler could understand. Aaron didn't celebrate. She simply nodded, lips pressed together. And for the first time, she looked like someone who believed the world might enforce a boundary on her behalf. Bennett glanced at Logan's notebook on the table, pages filled with dates, times, and observations, and gave a small, approving grunt. "Keep writing," she said. Then she looked at Atlas, who sat near Hannah's feet like a sunlit statue, and her expression softened. "And keep that dog close," she added. Atlas's tail thumped once, slow and dignified, as if he accepted the assignment. It was 2 days later when Aaron finally said the words that had been circling her like a hawk since the blanket. "We need to go see my mom." Logan was fixing a loose hinge on the back door when she said it. Her voice didn't shake, but her hands were busy folding a baby onesie that didn't need folding, the way people moved when they were trying to convince themselves they were ready. "She lives near Ignacio," Aaron continued. "Southern Ute side. I haven't been home since before Hannah was born." She swallowed. "And she never got answers about my dad. Not real ones." Logan's chest tightened, and guilt rose like a tide he'd been holding back with both hands. Atlas lifted his head, ears flicking, as if he could hear the truth forming before it was spoken. Logan set the hinge down carefully. "If you want me there," he said quietly, "I'll come." Aaron's eyes met his, hard, tired, honest. I do, she replied, then added, as if reminding herself she still had the right to be angry. Not to fix it, just to tell it. They left early the next morning. Mrs. Patel packed a cooler of sandwiches and pressed a small envelope into Aaron's hand on the porch. Gas money, she said briskly, and when Aaron tried to refuse, Patel gave her a look that could bend steel. It's not charity, Patel insisted. It's community. Let people be decent. Mason texted Logan a simple message. Proud of you. Proud of her. Call if you need anything. And Logan felt the knot in his chest loosen by a fraction. The drive south unspooled through white fields and dark pines, then into stretches where the snow thinned and the land turned the color of winter grass. Aaron sat in the passenger seat with the baby sleeping against her, gaze fixed on the horizon, like she was bracing for impact. Hannah watched out the window, quiet in a way that felt older than 12. Caleb asked where they were going every 20 miles, as if repetition made it safer. Sophie sang to Atlas in a whisper, a made-up song about Golden Atlas Mountain Guard, and Atlas responded by resting his chin on the edge of her car seat, eyes half closed, absorbing the sound as if it fed him. Logan drove with both hands steady on the wheel. The farther they went, the more the air seemed to change, from mountain knife edge to something broader, gentler, like the world was exhaling. Deborah Redfeather's house sat at the edge of a small cluster of homes, modest and sturdy, with a porch swept clean despite the season. Wind chimes made from smooth metal pieces clicked softly under the eaves. Aaron stopped at the bottom step and didn't move for a full 5 seconds. Atlas jumped down first and looked back at her, tail sweeping low, his posture saying the same thing he'd said on the pass. This way when you're ready. Aaron climbed the steps with the baby in her arms. The door opened before she could knock. Deborah stood there in a thick cardigan and worn jeans, her dark hair streaked with gray and pulled into a braid that rested over her shoulder. Her face was strong-boned and tired, eyes bright with the kind of grief that never fully unpacks its bags. For a moment, she stared at Aaron like she was seeing a ghost. Then her mouth trembled, and she stepped forward. Aaron's voice broke on a single word. Mom? Deborah wrapped her arms around Aaron carefully, not crushing the baby, just holding her daughter like she'd been waiting years for that exact wait. Hannah froze in the doorway, then moved forward and let Deborah touch her face with both hands, as if Deborah needed proof the grandchildren were real. Caleb hovered behind Aaron's leg until Deborah crouched and opened her arms. Sophie ran into them both, fearless in the way children are when they've finally found safety. Atlas sat on the porch, watching the reunion with a solemn patience, then stood and walked inside when Aaron glanced at him and nodded permission. He sniffed the floor once, then Deborah's outstretched hand. Deborah's fingers sank into Atlas's fur, and her eyes softened. He's been taking care of you, she said, not a question. Aaron's hand found Atlas's head, and she nodded. He has. Logan stayed near the doorframe, hat in his hands, suddenly aware of how big he was in a small space and how much he didn't belong to this family's histories. Deborah's gaze landed on him, sharp and steady. And you, she said, you're the one with the blanket. Logan's throat tightened. Yes, ma'am, he replied. Deborah didn't invite him in with words. She did it by stepping aside and pointing toward the kitchen table. The table was scratched and solid, the kind of table that held decades of meals and arguments and quiet prayers. Aaron sat with the baby. Hannah sat close enough to touch her mother's sleeve. Caleb and Sophie took seats on either side of Atlas, who lay down under the table with his paws stretched out like a warm foundation. Logan sat across from Deborah, hands flat on his knees. For a long time, no one spoke. Then Deborah reached into a drawer and pulled out a folded piece of paper. An old missing person notice, edges softened by handling. The name at the top read Thomas Redfeather, Aaron's father. Deborah's voice was quiet but unwavering. Tell me what happened, she said. Logan inhaled slowly, feeling Atlas's steady breathing under the table like a metronome. I was driving a mountain road years ago, Logan began. Storm came fast. I slid and ended up half over a ravine. I was trapped. I thought I was going to die. His voice stayed even, but his hands trembled slightly and he hated that it showed. Your husband, Thomas, came out of the storm. He didn't hesitate. He wrapped me in that blanket and pulled until my leg came free. Aaron's eyes squeezed shut. Deborah didn't look away. Logan swallowed. When he tried to climb back up, the edge broke. He fell. The room went quiet, but it wasn't empty quiet. It was the quiet of something finally landing in its proper place. Deborah's shoulders shook once, a single tremor that looked like a mountain shifting under snow. Aaron's breath hitched. Hannah stared at the table, jaw clenched so hard her cheeks went pale. Caleb's eyes filled. Sophie reached for Atlas's fur and held on. Atlas lifted his head and nudged Sophie's wrist, grounding her, then rested his chin back down, calm and present. Deborah closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, there were tears, but no rage, only an ache so deep it had had years to shape itself into something survivable. "He would do that," she whispered, more to herself than anyone. "He always ran toward trouble." Logan's throat burned. "I should have come sooner," he said. "I should have told you. I was ashamed. I was scared." Deborah looked at him for a long moment, and Logan held the gaze like a punishment he had earned. Then Deborah reached across the table and placed her hand over his, warm, steady, not forgiving everything, but releasing something. "My husband made choices," she said. "You didn't steal him. The mountain did." She glanced at Aaron, at the baby sleeping against her chest, at Hannah's rigid posture, at Caleb's tears, at Sophie gripping Atlas like a lifeline. "And now," Deborah added, voice firmer, "we choose what we do with what's left." Aaron's shoulders collapsed forward in a sob she'd been refusing for years. It wasn't loud. It was the sound of a dam cracking. Deborah moved around the table and held her daughter, rocking slightly. Atlas crawled out from under the table and pressed his body against Aaron's calf, leaning in until Aaron's hand found his fur and stayed there. Logan watched the scene with a strange, bruised gratitude. For the first time since the accident, the truth wasn't a weapon pointed at him. It was a bridge. That evening, Deborah cooked a simple meal, stew thick with potatoes, fry bread warm and soft, and the house filled with the kind of ordinary comfort that felt almost holy after months of survival. Neighbors drifted in quietly when they heard Aaron was home, offering casseroles and hugs and warm looks that didn't pry. Mason called, and Aaron actually answered, voice still raw. "We're okay," she told him. "We're here." Mason's reply crackled through the phone, gentle and proud. "Good," he said. "That's the point." After dinner, the children sprawled on the living room floor while Atlas accepted their affection with patient dignity. Hannah leaned against Atlas's side without realizing she was doing it. Caleb fell asleep with his hand on Atlas's harness strap. Sophie used Atlas's tail as a pretend paintbrush over the carpet, giggling until Deborah shushed her with a smile. Aaron sat by the window with the baby asleep, watching the dark sky. Logan stepped onto the porch for air, and Atlas followed, slipping outside with him like a silent escort. The night was crisp, stars sharp enough to hurt. Logan rubbed Atlas's ears and felt the dog lean into his hand, warm and solid. "We got them here," Logan whispered. Atlas exhaled a soft huff, as if to say, "Keep going." In the morning, before they left, Deborah folded the river and mountain blanket carefully and placed it in Aaron's arms. "This belongs with you now," she said. Aaron held it against her chest and nodded, tears bright but steady. Deborah turned to Logan. "And you," she said, eyes narrowing with the same sharp love she'd greeted him with. "What do you intend?" Logan didn't flinch. He didn't dress it up. "To keep them safe," he said. "To build a home where the kids don't have to listen for footsteps." He glanced at Aaron, then back at Deborah. "And to spend the rest of my life earning the right to stand beside her, if she'll let me." Aaron's breath caught, and for the first time she didn't look away. Deborah studied him, then nodded once. Small, decisive. "Then don't make promises you can't live," she said. Logan swallowed. "I won't." Spring came fast after that, as if the world had been waiting for permission. Snow receded from the fence line. The first crocuses broke through near the porch steps. Mason's volunteers returned to help Logan patch the roof, and Mrs. Patel showed up with wildflower seeds and a smirk that said she'd been right all along. Aaron planted the seeds with Sophie and Caleb, while Hannah held the baby and pretended she wasn't smiling. Atlas trotted in circles around them, barking once every so often just to be included. On a bright Saturday in late April, they gathered on the porch. Not a wedding, not yet, not a spectacle. Just family and friends and the slow, careful celebration of surviving. Sheriff Bennett stopped by in plain clothes, bringing a basket of muffins and a quiet, satisfied look. Lila dropped off paperwork confirming Derek's plea agreement and extended protections. Deborah arrived the day before and hugged Aaron like the hug was a new habit she refused to lose. Logan waited until everyone was there, until the kids were laughing, until the baby was asleep against Aaron's shoulder, until Atlas was sitting in the center of the porch with a ribbon tied to his harness and an expression that looked suspiciously proud. Logan took Aaron's hand. "I can't promise there won't be storms," he said, voice steady, eyes honest. "But I can promise you'll never walk through one alone again." Aaron stared at him for a long moment, then nodded, tears shining. Logan slipped a simple ring onto her finger, silver, engraved with a tiny line that curved like a river between two small mountain peaks. Atlas rose and pressed his head against Aaron's thigh, tail swishing, as if sealing the moment with warmth. Hannah let out a breath she'd been holding and leaned into her mother. Caleb whooped softly. Sophie clapped and hugged Atlas so hard the dog's ears flopped sideways. Aaron laughed, an actual laugh, full and startled, like she'd forgotten her body could do it. Logan wrapped an arm around her shoulders, and for the first time the cabin didn't feel like a place they hid. It felt like a place they chose. The wind lifted the porch chimes, and the sound was gentle, not a warning. Atlas trotted down the steps and back up again, doing a slow circle around the family, as if he was counting them one last time, making sure every soul was present. When he returned to Logan's side and sat, golden coat catching the sunlight, Logan understood the simplest truth of the whole ordeal. Some rescues aren't about pulling someone out of the snow. Sometimes they're about teaching a house to breathe and teaching people to believe they deserve to stay warm.